She thought her dad's 1957 Corvette was lost forever, until a stranger called at midnight. In the heart of small-town Michigan, Sarah Martinez thought she had lost the last tangible connection to her late father when his prized 1957 Corvette disappeared from their family garage 3 years ago. The cherry red convertible wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of her father's dreams, their weekend adventures, and the bond they shared over grease-stained hands and shared stories under the hood. Now 32 and struggling to keep her father's auto repair shop afloat while raising her teenage daughter Emma alone, Sarah has resigned herself to the painful reality that the Corvette and those precious memories are gone forever. But when a mysterious phone call at midnight from a stranger named Marcus claims he's found her father's car in an abandoned warehouse in Detroit, Sarah's world is turned upside down. What follows is an emotional journey of rediscovery, forgiveness, and the power of community as Sarah embarks on a quest that will test her courage, challenge her assumptions about family loyalty, and ultimately teach her that sometimes the things we think we've lost forever are just waiting for us to be brave enough to find them again. This is a story about second chances, the healing power of vintage engines, and how the ghosts of our past can guide us toward an unexpected future. If these stories moved you, imagine what's coming next. Subscribe to Rust and Memory, because some engines don't just start cars, they start memories. Chapter 1. The Weight of Empty Spaces. The November wind cut through Millbrook, Michigan like a rusty blade, rattling the windows of Martinez Auto Repair and carrying with it the promise of another harsh winter. Sarah Martinez pulled her worn flannel jacket tighter around her shoulders as she surveyed the cluttered garage that had been her second home for the past 32 years. First as her father's shadow, then as his partner, and now as its reluctant owner. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting dancing shadows across the oil-stained concrete floor where her father, Roberto Martinez, had once taught her the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. That was back when the garage buzzed with activity, when customers lined up around the block because nobody in 3 counties could diagnose an engine problem like Roberto Martinez. Now, on this particularly grey Tuesday afternoon, the garage felt cavernous and hollow. Only 2 cars sat in the 4 available bays, Mrs. Henderson's ancient Buick with a transmission that wheezed like an old dog, and Tommy Sullivan's pickup truck that needed new brake pads. Barely enough work to keep the lights on, let alone pay the mounting bills that seemed to multiply like weeds in her father's old oak desk. Sarah ran her fingers along the workbench where Roberto had kept his tools in perfect order, each wrench and socket in its designated place. She could still hear his voice, thick with his Mexican accent but clear as church bells. "Mija, a mechanic without organization is like a chef without a recipe. You might get lucky sometimes, but you'll never be great. Mom, you're doing that thing again." The voice belonged to Emma, her 17-year-old daughter, who had inherited Roberto's keen observation skills along with his stubborn streak. Emma stood in the doorway between the garage and the small office, her backpack slung over one shoulder and her dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail that reminded Sarah painfully of herself at that age. "What thing?" Sarah asked, though she knew exactly what Emma meant. "That staring into space thing, where you look like you're waiting for Grandpa to come walking through that door with a cup of coffee and some story about the good old days." Emma's voice carried the particular blend of affection and exasperation that only teenage daughters could master. Sarah smiled despite herself. Emma was right, of course. It had been 3 years since Roberto's heart attack, but Sarah still caught herself listening for the familiar sound of his work boots on the concrete, still expected to see his weathered hands reaching for his favorite wrench. "How was school?" Sarah asked, deflecting as she always did when the conversation veered too close to the grief that still felt fresh as an open wound. "Boring, mister." Peterson is still trying to convince me that calculus will be useful in real life, and Jessica Morrison is still convinced that her dad's Mustang is faster than anything in this town." Emma dropped her backpack with a thud that echoed through the empty garage. "I told her she was wrong, obviously." "Obviously," Sarah agreed, though the mention of fast cars sent a familiar pang through her chest. There had been a time when the fastest car in Millbrook, hell, probably in all of Washtenaw County, had sat right here, in this very garage. A 1957 Chevrolet Corvette convertible, painted a shade of red that Roberto had called Cherry Sunset, and Sarah had simply called Perfect. The Corvette had been Roberto's pride and joy, a project car he'd bought as a rusted shell when Sarah was 12 and spent the next 6 years lovingly restoring. Every weekend, they'd worked on it together, Sarah handing him tools, learning the names of every part, understanding how each component worked in harmony with the others to create something beautiful and powerful. When Roberto finished the restoration, the Corvette had been museum quality, chrome that gleamed like mirrors, an engine that purred like a contented cat, and paint so deep and lustrous it seemed to glow from within. But Roberto had never treated it like a show car. Instead, he'd taken Sarah for drives every Sunday after church, the wind whipping through their hair as they cruised the back roads of Michigan, talking about everything and nothing. Those drives had stopped when Sarah turned 18 and left for college. Then came marriage, divorce, Emma's birth, and all the complications of adult life that made leisurely Sunday drives seem like luxuries from another lifetime. The Corvette had sat in the garage, patient and waiting, covered by a canvas top that Roberto had replaced religiously every few months. And then, 3 months after Roberto's funeral, it had vanished. Sarah had come to the garage early one morning to find the bay where the Corvette had been stored empty, except for a few drops of oil on the concrete. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, no witnesses. The police had filed a report, but with no leads and no security cameras, the case had quickly gone cold. The insurance money had helped keep the shop afloat for a while, but losing the Corvette had felt like losing Roberto all over again. It was the last tangible piece of her father she'd had left, and now it was gone, probably chopped up for parts or sitting in some collector's climate-controlled garage, where it would never again feel the wind or hear the laughter of a father and daughter sharing a perfect Sunday afternoon. "Earth to Mom," Emma's voice cut through Sarah's reverie. "I asked if you wanted me to help with Mrs. Henderson's car. I've got about 2 hours before I need to start on that English paper." Sarah looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw so much of Roberto in the girl's eager expression. Emma had been working in the shop since she was old enough to hold a flashlight steady, and at 17 she could diagnose most common problems as well as mechanics twice her age. She had gifted hands and an intuitive understanding of how machines worked, gifts that Roberto had recognized and nurtured before his death. "You know what?" Sarah said, making a decision that surprised even her. "Why don't you take the lead on Mrs. Henderson's transmission? I'll supervise and jump in if you need help, but I think you're ready to handle it yourself." Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? You trust me with a full transmission rebuild?" "Your grandfather always said that the best way to learn is by doing," Sarah replied. "Besides, if you're going to take over this place someday, you need to know you can handle the big jobs." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. They'd never explicitly discussed Emma's future, but it had always been understood that the garage would eventually pass to her, just as it had passed from Roberto to Sarah. It was legacy, tradition, the natural order of things in the Martinez family. But as Sarah watched Emma eagerly gather the tools she'd need for the transmission work, a cold knot of worry formed in her stomach. What kind of legacy was she really passing on? A struggling business in a dying town? A garage that barely broke even in good months and lost money in bad ones? A building full of memories and empty bays? The phone rang, jarring Sarah from her dark thoughts. The caller ID showed a local number she didn't recognize, which usually meant a potential customer, something they desperately needed. "Martinez Auto Repair," she answered, forcing cheer into her voice. "This is Sarah." "Hello, is this the daughter of Roberto Martinez?" The voice was male, older, with the careful pronunciation of someone for whom English was a second language. "Yes," Sarah replied cautiously. "May I ask who's calling?" "My name is Carlos Medina. I worked with your father many years ago, before you were born. I am calling from Grand Rapids, and I have some information about your father's red Corvette." Sarah's hand tightened on the phone. In the 3 years since the theft, she'd gotten dozens of calls from people claiming to have information about the car. Most were scammers looking for reward money that didn't exist. A few were well-meaning but mistaken, people who'd seen red Corvettes that weren't Roberto's. All had led to dead ends and disappointment. "I appreciate the call, Mr. Medina," she said carefully, "but we've had a lot of false leads over the years. If you don't mind me asking, how did you get this number, and what makes you think you have information about my father's specific car?" "I understand your caution," Carlos replied, "but I knew your father well. We worked together at the Ford plant in Detroit in the 1980s, before he opened his shop. Roberto used to show me pictures of the Corvette when he was restoring it. He was very proud of that car, and of you." Sarah felt her skepticism wavering. The details were right. Roberto had worked at the Ford plant before opening the shop, and he had been known to show pictures of both his car and his daughter to anyone who would look. But scammers could research these things. "What can you tell me?" she asked. "I believe I have found Roberto's car," Carlos said simply. "It is in Detroit, in a warehouse that is scheduled for demolition next month. The owner of the warehouse called me because he knows I collect classic cars, and he wanted to know if I was interested in buying it before the building comes down." Sarah's heart began to race. "And you think it's my father's car?" "I am certain it is," Carlos replied. "The VIN number matches the one from the police report. I have a friend in the department who was able to look it up for me. But more than that, there are details that only someone who knew Roberto would recognize. A small dent in the rear bumper from when he backed into a post in 1996. A cigarette burn in the passenger seat that he got when your Uncle Miguel visited. Small things, but they are Roberto's marks on the car." Sarah sank into the worn office chair behind Roberto's desk, her legs suddenly unsteady. Could it really be possible? After 3 years of dead ends and false hopes, could the Corvette actually be found? "Where in Detroit?" she asked, hardly daring to breathe. "A warehouse district near the old Tiger Stadium site. The building is owned by a man named Frank Kowalski. He seems honest enough, but he is anxious to get the car out before the demolition crew arrives. If you are interested, you would need to act quickly." Sarah's mind raced through the logistics. Detroit was a 2-hour drive from Millbrook. She'd need to arrange for someone to watch the shop, figure out how to transport the car if it really was Roberto's, and somehow come up with whatever money Frank Kowalski might want for it. "Mr. Medina," she said, "I appreciate the call, and I hope you're right about the car, but I need to ask, what's in this for you? Why would you go to all this trouble for someone you've never met?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Carlos spoke again, his voice was softer, tinged with emotion. "Your father helped me once, many years ago. I was new to this country, barely spoke English, and I was having trouble at the plant. Some of the other workers were not welcoming to immigrants. Roberto stood up for me, made sure I was treated fairly. He even invited me to his house for dinner, where I met your mother and saw pictures of you as a little girl." Sarah remembered that dinner, though she'd been too young to understand its significance at the time. A quiet man with kind eyes who'd spoken Spanish with her father and complimented her mother's cooking. "Roberto was a good man," Carlos continued. "When I heard about his passing, and later about the stolen car, it broke my heart. Finding that Corvette would not bring Roberto back, but perhaps it could bring back a piece of him for you and your daughter. Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. It was exactly the kind of thing her father would have done, helping a stranger, paying forward kindness without expectation of reward. "When can I see it?" she asked. "Tomorrow, if you like. The warehouse owner will be there in the afternoon. I could meet you there, help with the translation if needed. Frank speaks English, but his Polish accent is very thick." "I'll be there," Sarah said without hesitation. "Can you give me the address?" As she wrote down the information, Sarah caught sight of Emma watching her from the garage doorway, transmission parts forgotten. Her daughter's expression was a mixture of curiosity and hope that made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. After she hung up, Emma approached the desk cautiously. "Was that about Grandpa's car?" "Maybe," Sarah replied, not wanting to raise Emma's hopes too high. "A man thinks he might have found it in Detroit. We'll know more tomorrow." Emma's eyes widened. "Can I come with you?" Sarah's first instinct was to say no. If this turned out to be another dead end, she didn't want Emma to experience that disappointment. But then, she looked at her daughter's eager face and realized that Emma deserved to be part of this. The Corvette wasn't just Sarah's connection to Roberto, it was Emma's too, part of her heritage and her grandfather's legacy. "Okay," Sarah said, "but we'll need to close the shop for the afternoon, and you'll have to make up that English paper when we get back." "Deal," Emma said quickly, then paused. "Mum, do you really think it could be Grandpa's car?" Sarah looked out through the office window at the empty bay where the Corvette had once sat, where Roberto had spent countless hours polishing chrome and fine-tuning the engine. She thought about Carlos Medina's story, about her father's kindness to a struggling immigrant, about the strange way the universe sometimes worked to bring things full circle. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said honestly, "but I think it's worth finding out." As the afternoon wore on and they worked together on Mrs. Henderson's transmission, Sarah found herself thinking about the phone call. Part of her was terrified of getting her hopes up only to have them crushed again. But a larger part, the part that still heard Roberto's voice in the wind and felt his presence in every corner of the garage, whispered that maybe, just maybe, tomorrow would bring them home. The phone call had awakened something in Sarah that she'd thought was buried with her father. Hope. And as dangerous as hope could be, as much as it could hurt when it was disappointed, she realized she was ready to risk that pain for the chance, however slim, of getting back a piece of the man who had shaped her into who she was. Outside, the November wind continued to rattle the windows, but now it sounded less like a threat and more like a promise. Tomorrow she and Emma would drive to Detroit. Tomorrow they might find more than just a car. They might find a way back to the parts of themselves they thought they'd lost forever. Chapter 2. Echoes in the City. The drive to Detroit took Sarah and Emma through the heart of Michigan's industrial landscape, past closed factories with broken windows, small towns that seemed to be holding their breath, and billboards advertising casinos and fast food as if they were the only forms of hope left in the region. Sarah had made this drive countless times when she was younger, usually to visit relatives or attend car shows with Roberto, but today the familiar route felt charged with possibility and dread in equal measure. Emma sat in the passenger seat of their aging Ford pickup, alternately staring out the window and checking her phone, clearly fighting her own mixture of excitement and skepticism. They'd left Millbrook at noon, after arranging for Jerry Kowalski, no relation to the warehouse owner, as far as they knew, to keep an eye on the shop for the afternoon. Jerry was 73 and mostly retired, but he'd been one of Roberto's closest friends and had refused to accept payment for watching over the business. "Tell me again about the last time you saw the Corvette," Emma said, as they passed through Ann Arbor, the University of Michigan campus sprawling on either side of the highway. Sarah had told this story dozens of times to police officers, insurance investigators, and anyone else who would listen, but she understood Emma's need to hear it again. Sometimes the details of traumatic events needed to be repeated like prayers, worn smooth by repetition until they became bearable. "It was a Tuesday morning in March," Sarah began, her hands steady on the steering wheel. 3 months after Grandpa's funeral. I'd come in early to work on Dave Patterson's motorcycle. You remember Dave? He used to bring us those terrible homemade cookies every Christmas. Emma nodded. Dave Patterson had died the previous winter, another familiar face lost to the relentless march of time. The Corvette was under its cover, same as always. Everything looked normal. I worked on the motorcycle until about 10, then went home to have lunch with you. When I came back that afternoon, the bay was empty. No broken glass, no signs of forced entry, just gone. And the police never found anything? Nothing useful. A few people thought they'd seen a red Corvette being transported on a flatbed truck that morning, but the descriptions were too vague to help. The detective, what was his name? Morrison, I think, said it was probably stolen to order. Classic Corvettes are worth a lot of money to the right buyer, especially one in the condition Grandpa's was in. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. Do you think someone specifically targeted our car? Like someone who knew about it? It was a question that had haunted Sarah for 3 years. Millbrook was a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Roberto's Corvette hadn't been a secret. He'd driven it regularly, taken it to car shows, won several trophies with it. Anyone in town could have known about it, known the shop's routine, known when it would be vulnerable. I don't know, Sarah admitted. I've wondered about that a lot. But the truth is, it could have been anyone. A passing thief who got lucky, someone from out of town who'd heard about the car, or... She trailed off, not wanting to voice the suspicion that had gnawed at her for years. Or someone we know, Emma finished quietly. They drove in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. The landscape outside grew more urban as they approached Detroit, abandoned lots giving way to warehouses and industrial buildings. Sarah had always loved this city despite its struggles. There was something about Detroit's resilience, its refusal to give up in the face of seemingly impossible odds, that reminded her of her father. Roberto had been born in Mexico, but had made Detroit his first American home, working in the auto plants and learning English from co-workers who became lifelong friends. He'd often told Sarah that Detroit was a city of builders, people who understood that things worth having were worth working for. Looking at the city now, with its mix of decay and renewal, Sarah wondered if her father would recognize the place he'd once called home. The warehouse district where they were supposed to meet Carlos Medina was in an area Sarah didn't know well, a collection of aging industrial buildings near the Detroit River, some still in use, but many standing empty, waiting for demolition or redevelopment that might never come. She followed the GPS directions down increasingly narrow streets until she found the address Carlos had given her. The building was a 3-story brick structure that might have been impressive once, but now looked tired and forgotten. Most of its windows were boarded up, and graffiti covered the lower walls in layers of overlapping tags and murals. A sign near the entrance read, "Kowalski Storage and Salvage," but the letters were faded and several were missing entirely. Sarah parked across the street and checked her phone. They were 15 minutes early, which was exactly how Roberto had taught her to be. Early enough to observe and assess, but not so early as to seem over-eager. She and Emma sat in the truck, studying the building and trying to spot any signs of life. "Looks pretty deserted," Emma observed. "Most of these old warehouses are," Sarah replied. "But that doesn't mean much. Carlos said the owner uses it for storage, not active business." At exactly 2 p.m., a silver Honda Accord pulled up in front of the warehouse. An older Mexican man got out, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body had logged many years of physical labor. He was shorter than Roberto had been, with grey hair and weathered hands, but something about his posture reminded Sarah of her father. "That must be Carlos," she said, getting out of the truck. Carlos Medina looked exactly like his voice had suggested. Kind eyes, careful movements, the bearing of a man who had earned his place in the world through hard work and integrity. He smiled when he saw Sarah and Emma approaching, and Sarah was struck by how familiar that smile seemed, as if she'd seen it before in old photographs or half-remembered childhood encounters. "Sarah?" he asked, extending his hand. "You look very much like your father, especially around the eyes." "Mr. Medina, thank you so much for calling," Sarah replied, shaking his hand. "This is my daughter Emma." Carlos's smile widened as he looked at Emma. "Roberto's granddaughter. He would be so proud to see you. You have his hands, good for working with machines." Emma blushed slightly, but seemed pleased by the comparison. Before anyone could say more, a battered pickup truck rumbled up the street and parked behind Carlos's Honda. The man who got out was large and powerful-looking despite his age, with arms like tree trunks and a face that suggested he'd lived through more than his share of hard times. "That's Frank Kowalski," Carlos said quietly. "He's gruff, but honest. His family has owned this building for 40 years. Frank approached them with the rolling gait of someone whose knees had absorbed decades of punishment. He was probably in his 60s, with grey hair cut military short and eyes that missed nothing. When he spoke, his accent was indeed thick, but his English was clear and direct. "You're Roberto's daughter?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, sir, Sarah Martinez." She extended her hand, and Frank shook it with a grip that could have crushed walnuts. "Good. Carlos tells me you've been looking for this car for a long time. 3 years, yes?" "That's right. It was stolen from our shop in 2021. Frank nodded grimly. "Lot of stolen cars end up in places like this. People store them, wait for heat to cool down, then sell them or ship them overseas. Your car, it's been here almost 3 years now. Guy who brought it, he paid 6 months' rent in advance, then disappeared. Never came back, never answered phone." Sarah felt a chill of excitement mixed with dread. The timeline matched perfectly with the theft. "Can you describe the man who brought it?" "Tall, skinny, maybe 40 years old. Light brown hair, needed a shave. Spoke English good, but I think maybe he was not born here. Had accent, but not like mine. Maybe Spanish, maybe Italian." Frank shrugged. "Hard to say. He paid cash, gave fake name. I didn't ask too many questions. In my business, you learn not to." Sarah exchanged glances with Emma. The description could fit dozens of men in their area, but something about it nagged at her. She pushed the thought aside for now. "Can we see the car?" she asked. Frank nodded and pulled out a ring of keys that would have impressed a medieval jailer. "Is upstairs. Guy wanted it out of sight, away from street level. Cost him extra, but he paid without arguing." They followed Frank through a side door into the warehouse. The interior was dimly lit by windows that hadn't been cleaned in years, and the air smelled of motor oil, rust, and time. The ground floor was filled with stacks of auto parts, old furniture, and the accumulated detritus of a dozen failed businesses. Narrow aisles wound between the piles like paths through a junkyard maze. "Building is scheduled for demolition first week of December," Frank explained, as they climbed a set of metal stairs that clanged under their feet. "City wants to put in condos or offices or some such thing. Good thing Carlos called when he did. Few more weeks, and Carr would have gone to scrapyard with everything else." The second floor was less cluttered but more eerie. Empty office spaces with broken windows looked out over the Detroit River, and Sarah could see the Ambassador Bridge in the distance, connecting Michigan to Canada. This floor seemed to be used primarily for vehicle storage. She counted at least a dozen cars and trucks covered by tarps or sheets, waiting like sleeping giants for owners who might never return. Frank led them to the far corner of the building, where a blue canvas tarp covered something that was unmistakably car-shaped. Sarah's heart began to pound as they approached it. The proportions looked right for a Corvette, and the height suggested a convertible. "You ready?" Frank asked, his hand on the corner of the tarp. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Emma moved closer, and Sarah could feel her daughter's excitement like electricity in the air. Frank pulled the tarp away with a flourish, and Sarah's world stopped. It was Roberto's Corvette. There was no doubt, no possibility of mistake. The cherry sunset paint gleamed even in the dim warehouse light. The chrome bumpers reflected their faces like mirrors, and every curve and line was exactly as Sarah remembered. But more than the visual perfection, it was the emotional impact that convinced her. Looking at the car was like seeing her father again, like being transported back to those perfect Sunday afternoons when she was 12 years old and the world was full of possibility. "Oh my God," Emma whispered. "Mom, is that really—" "It's Grandpa's car," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's really his car." She approached the Corvette slowly, almost reverently. Carlos had been right about the details only someone who knew Roberto would recognize. There was the small dent in the rear bumper from the post incident. Roberto had been backing out of their driveway one winter morning when ice made him slide just far enough to kiss their mailbox post. He'd been so angry at himself that he'd spoken Spanish for an hour, a sure sign of deep frustration. The cigarette burn in the passenger seat was there too, a small brown mark that Roberto had tried unsuccessfully to repair. Emma's uncle Miguel had been visiting from Texas, and despite Roberto's strict no-smoking rule in the car, Miguel had let his cigarette slip during an animated story about a woman he'd met at a dance hall. Roberto had been furious, but the damage was done. "The keys should be in glove compartment," Frank said. "Guy who brought it said owner always kept spare set there." Sarah opened the passenger door and popped the glove compartment. Sure enough, there was Roberto's spare key ring, the one with the miniature wrench keychain she'd given him for Father's Day when she was 14. Her hands shook as she picked up the keys. "You want to start her up?" Frank asked. "Battery is probably dead, but I got jumper cables if you need them." Sarah looked at Emma, who nodded eagerly. They both wanted to hear the sound of Roberto's engine, to know that the heart of the car was still strong. The engine turned over on the third try, settling into the familiar purr that had been the soundtrack of Sarah's childhood. The sound was perfect, not the rough idle of an engine that had been sitting for years, but the smooth, confident rumble of a machine that had been built with love and maintained with care. "Somebody has been taking good care of this car," Carlos observed, running his hand along the pristine fender. "This is not how car looks after sitting in warehouse for 3 years without attention." Frank nodded in agreement. "Guy who brought it, he came by maybe once every few months, always at night, always alone. I figured he was working on it, keeping it running. Sometimes I could hear engine running up here, see lights on. None of my business, as long as rent was paid." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. Someone had been maintaining the car for 3 years, someone who cared enough to keep it in perfect condition, but not enough to return it to its rightful owner. The thought made her angry and sad in equal measure. "Mr. Kowalski," she said, "what happens now? I can prove this is my father's car. I have the title, the insurance paperwork, photos of him with it. But legally speaking, what are my options?" Frank scratched his stubbled chin thoughtfully. "Well, technically, car belongs to whoever has been paying storage fees. But seeing as how he hasn't paid anything in over 2 years and has abandoned property, I got legal right to dispose of it however I want. Question is, what do you think is fair?" Sarah had been dreading this conversation. She and Emma lived paycheck to paycheck, and the shop barely broke even most months. She had maybe $3,000 in savings, and no idea how much Frank might want for the car. "What would be fair to you?" she asked carefully. Frank was quiet for a long moment, studying the Corvette with the eye of someone who understood the value of things both monetary and sentimental. Finally, he looked at Sarah with an expression that reminded her of her father. Your father, Roberto. Carlos tells me he was good man. Helped people when they needed help, never asked for nothing in return. That true?" "Yes," Sarah said simply. "It's true." "Then here's what I think is fair. You pay me what it cost to store car for 3 years. Call it $3,000, round number. That covers my expenses and headache of dealing with abandoned property. Car is yours, clean and legal." Sarah felt her heart sink. $3,000 might as well have been $30,000 given her current financial situation. She was about to explain this when Emma stepped forward. "Mr. Kowalski, could we work out some kind of payment plan? My mum runs our family's auto repair shop, and we could maybe do work for you instead of paying cash. We're really good at what we do. Grandpa taught us everything he knew." Frank studied Emma with new interest. "You work on cars, young lady?" "Since I was 8, Emma replied proudly. "I can rebuild a transmission, tune an engine, and I'm learning bodywork. Mum says I have Grandpa's hands." Frank smiled for the first time since they'd met him. "Roberto's granddaughter who can rebuild transmissions. I like that." He looked at Sarah. "I got several vehicles need work, nothing fancy, just maintenance and repairs on my personal trucks. You do work for me, we call it even. Deal?" Sarah felt tears of relief and gratitude prick at her eyes. "Deal," she said, extending her hand. As they shook on it, Carlos cleared his throat. "There is one more thing," he said. "I have been thinking about this situation, about who might have taken Roberto's car and why they would keep it here, maintaining it but not selling it." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "Think about it. This person knew Roberto well enough to know about car, knew your shop well enough to take it without being seen. But instead of selling it immediately, which would be smart thing to do if you were a professional thief, they bring it here and take care of it for 3 years. They pay storage fees. They maintain engine. They keep it in perfect condition. This is not behavior of stranger who steals car for money." Sarah felt that chill again, stronger this time. "You think it was someone we know? I think it was someone who loved Roberto or thought they did. Someone who couldn't bear to see cars sold or given away, but also couldn't return it. Someone who wanted to preserve it exactly as Roberto left it." Emma looked between the adults, processing this. "Like someone in our family, or someone who worked for Grandpa." "Maybe," Carlos said gently. "Or maybe someone who felt they had claimed a car that was stronger than yours." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Sarah thought about all the people who had known about the Corvette, who had access to the shop, who might have felt entitled to take something that wasn't legally theirs. The list was shorter than she'd like to admit, and filled with names of people she'd trusted. But standing here in this warehouse, with Roberto's car purring softly beside her and the Detroit River flowing toward Lake Erie outside the windows, Sarah realized that the identity of the thief mattered less than she'd thought it would. What mattered was that the car was found, that it could come home, that Emma would have the chance to understand this piece of her grandfather's legacy. "We'll figure out who took it eventually," she said, more to herself than to the others. "But right now, let's focus on getting it back where it belongs." Frank nodded approvingly. "Smart woman, past is past. What matters is future, but you'll need truck to transport it unless you want to risk driving it home. Roads are full of salt this time of year, and you don't want a damaged paint job." "I can arrange transport," Carlos offered. "I know people who specialize in moving classic cars. Shouldn't cost too much, and car will be safe." Udi, as they made arrangements for the Corvette's homecoming, Sarah found herself watching Emma, who had opened the hood and was studying the engine with the focused attention of a true mechanic. Roberto's blood ran strong in his granddaughter, and Sarah realized that maybe the legacy she was passing on wasn't just a struggling business in a small town. Maybe it was something more valuable. The knowledge of how things worked, the satisfaction of fixing what was broken, the understanding that with enough patience and skill, almost anything could be restored to its former glory. The November sun was setting as they finally left the warehouse, painting the Detroit sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Sarah of the Corvette's cherry sunset paint. Tomorrow, Carlos would arrange for the car to be transported back to Millbrook, and then the real work would begin. Not just the mechanical work of ensuring everything was perfect, but the emotional work of integrating this piece of the past into their present reality. As they drove home through the gathering darkness, Emma was unusually quiet, staring out at the lights of passing towns. Finally, she spoke. "Mom, when we get the car home, can we take it for a drive, like you and Grandpa used to do?" Sarah smiled, feeling something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The anticipation of a perfect Sunday afternoon with nowhere to go but wherever the road might lead them. "Absolutely," she said. "It's what he would have wanted." Chapter 3. The Weight of Secrets. The Corvette arrived in Millbrook on a Thursday morning, transported on a covered trailer by 2 men who handled it with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. Sarah and Emma watched from the garage doorway as the car was carefully unloaded, its cherry sunset paint gleaming in the pale November sunlight like a jewel that had been lost and found again. Word traveled fast in a small town. By noon, a steady stream of curious neighbors, former customers and old friends had stopped by the shop to see Roberto's Corvette. Some came with genuine excitement and shared memories. Others came with the particular hunger for drama that seemed to flourish in places where nothing much ever happened. All of them wanted to know the same thing: who had taken it, and why had they kept it hidden for 3 years? Sarah found herself telling the warehouse story over and over, each repetition wearing the edges of her initial euphoria and replacing it with a growing unease. Because the more she thought about Carlos Medina's theory that the thief had been someone who knew and cared about Roberto, the more convinced she became that he was right. And if he was right, then the person responsible was probably someone she saw regularly, someone she trusted, someone who had been watching her grieve the loss of the car while knowing exactly where it was. Emma seemed to sense her mother's troubled mood. As the afternoon wore on and the stream of visitors finally dwindled, she approached Sarah with the careful expression she wore when she was trying to solve a particularly complex mechanical problem. "You're thinking about what Mr. Medina said, aren't you?" Emma asked. "About it being someone we know?" Sarah nodded, running her hand along the Corvette's pristine fender. "I can't help it. The more I think about it, the more it makes sense. A stranger would have sold this car immediately. Do you know what a '57 Corvette in this condition is worth? Probably $60,000, maybe more. But instead, someone kept it hidden and maintained it for 3 years. That's not the behavior of a car thief. That's the behavior of someone who... Someone who what? Sarah struggled to put her suspicions into words. Someone who thought they deserved it more than we did. Someone who maybe felt like Dad owed them something, or like they had a better claim to his memory than his own daughter. The bell above the shop door chimed, interrupting their conversation. Sarah looked up to see Detective Ray Morrison entering the garage, and her heart immediately began to race. Morrison was the officer who had handled the original theft investigation, a thorough, methodical man in his 50s who had always treated the case with appropriate seriousness despite the limited leads. "Sarah, Emma," he said, nodding to both of them. "I heard through the grapevine that Roberto's Corvette turned up. Thought I'd stop by and take a look, maybe ask a few questions." "Of course," Sarah replied, though part of her wondered if she really wanted to know the answers to whatever questions Morrison might ask. The car was home now, legally hers according to the paperwork Frank Kowalski had provided. Did it really matter who had taken it? Morrison walked slowly around the Corvette, his trained eye taking in details that casual observers might miss. He photographed the VIN number, made notes about the car's condition, and asked Sarah to recount the story of finding it in Detroit. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the information. 3 years of storage fees paid in advance, then nothing. he mused. Monthly visits for maintenance, no attempt to sell or modify the vehicle. He looked at Sarah directly. I have to agree with your friend Carlos. This doesn't fit the pattern of a typical auto theft. This feels personal. That's what we've been thinking too, Emma said, but we can't figure out who would do something like this. Morrison pulled out a small notebook and flipped through several pages. Let me refresh your memory about the original investigation. We interviewed everyone who had access to your shop, everyone who knew about the car's routine storage schedule. That included family members, employees, regular customers, and a few people in town who were known car enthusiasts. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. And most of them had solid alibis for the morning it disappeared. But there were a few people we couldn't definitively rule out. Morrison consulted his notes. Your ex-husband, Michael Chen, for one. He was supposed to be at work in Ann Arbor that morning, but his supervisor said he called in sick. We could never verify where he actually was. Sarah shook her head immediately. Michael wouldn't do this. We had our problems, but he's not a thief. And he never cared about the Corvette. He always said classic cars were a waste of money. Maybe, Morrison said, but people do strange things when relationships end badly. What about Roberto's business partner from the early days, Vincent Moreau? We could never track him down for an interview. Last known address was in Florida, but the trail went cold. Vince moved to Tampa in the 90s, Sarah said. I haven't heard from him in years, and I doubt he even knew Dad still had the car. Morrison made another note. Then there's the more recent addition to our list of persons of interest, someone who wasn't on our original radar because he seemed above suspicion. Who? Sarah asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew. Tommy Sullivan. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. Tommy Sullivan had been Roberto's protégé, a young man Roberto had hired straight out of high school and trained in all aspects of auto repair. He'd worked at the shop for 8 years, becoming almost like a son to Roberto and a trusted friend to Sarah. When Roberto died, Tommy had been one of the pallbearers. He'd promised to help Sarah keep the shop running, to honor Roberto's memory by maintaining the high standards he'd established. And then, 3 months after Roberto's funeral, right around the time the Corvette disappeared, Tommy had suddenly quit and moved to Chicago, claiming he'd found a better job with a dealership there. Sarah had been hurt by his abrupt departure, but she'd attributed it to grief and the difficulty of working in a place so filled with memories of Roberto. Why are you bringing up Tommy now? Sarah asked, though her voice sounded strange in her own ears. Morrison's expression was grim. Because I did some follow-up work after you called, about finding the car. I contacted the Chicago Police Department to see if they could locate Sullivan for questioning. Turns out he never worked for any dealership in Chicago. The address he gave you as his forwarding address, it's a vacant lot. Emma looked confused. But Tommy sends Christmas cards every year, and he called to check on us after that bad ice storm last winter. The Christmas cards are postmarked from Chicago, Morrison acknowledged, but anyone can drive to Chicago to mail a card. As for the phone calls, he shrugged. Cell phones make it easy to call from anywhere and make it seem like you're calling from somewhere else. Sarah felt the garage spinning slightly around her. Tommy Sullivan, the young man Roberto had treated like family, who had learned everything he knew from her father, who had keys to the shop and knew exactly when the Corvette would be unguarded. The young man who had always admired the car, who had begged Roberto to let him take it for drives, who had been quietly resentful when Roberto always said no. I need to sit down, she said, moving toward the office chair behind Roberto's desk. Morrison followed her, his expression sympathetic but determined. I know this is hard to hear, Sarah, but the timeline fits perfectly. Sullivan had opportunity, access, and knowledge. He also had motive. What motive? Emma asked, moving to stand protectively beside her mother. According to several people I interviewed, Sullivan expected Roberto to leave him the shop when he died. He'd been working there for 8 years, had put his heart and soul into the business. When he found out that Roberto had left everything to Sarah instead, he was apparently pretty upset. Sarah remembered those difficult weeks after Roberto's funeral, the awkward conversations with Tommy about the future of the shop. She'd assumed he was just grieving, just struggling with the transition from Roberto's leadership to hers. She'd never considered that he might feel cheated, might believe he deserved more than the modest inheritance Roberto had left him in his will. So you think Tommy took the car as some kind of, and what? Revenge? Compensation for what he felt he was owed? It's possible, Morrison said. Or maybe he just couldn't bear to see it sold or given away. Maybe he thought he was preserving it, keeping it safe until some future date when he could figure out what to do with it. But maintaining it all these years, Sarah said slowly, paying storage fees, keeping it running, that would have cost him thousands of dollars. Which brings us to another interesting development, Morrison said. I did some research on Sullivan's financial situation. According to his credit report, he's been receiving regular payments from an account registered to something called MT Automotive Consulting. Ever heard of it? Sarah shook her head, but Emma suddenly straightened up. Wait, Mom, remember those invoices you found in Grandpa's desk? The ones for consulting work he did in the months before he died? I think some of them were paid through a company with those initials. Sarah felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Roberto had done consulting work for several small auto shops in the region, helping them modernize their practices and improve their customer service. It had been a source of extra income in his semi-retirement, and he'd been proud of the relationships he'd built with younger shop owners who sought his advice. If Tommy was paying himself from one of Dad's consulting accounts, Sarah said, then he's been stealing from us for 3 years, not just the car. Morrison nodded grimly. That's what it looks like. I'll need to get a warrant to examine the financial records, but I'm betting we'll find that Sullivan has been systematically draining that account to pay for the car's storage and maintenance. The implications were staggering. Not only had Tommy stolen the Corvette, but he'd been funding its care by embezzling money that should have helped keep the shop afloat. Money that might have made the difference between struggling and thriving, between barely paying the bills and having enough left over for Emma's college fund. What happens now? Emma asked. Now we build a case, Morrison replied. I'll get warrants for Sullivan's financial records, put out a BOLO alert for him in the Chicago area, and start the process of bringing him back to Michigan to face charges. It might take a while, but we'll get him. After Morrison left, Sarah and Emma sat in the quiet garage, both struggling to process what they'd learned. The return of the Corvette, which should have been purely joyful, was now tainted by the knowledge of who had taken it and why. Sarah found herself looking at the car differently, seeing not just Roberto's pride and joy, but also the symbol of a betrayal that cut deeper than simple theft. I can't believe it was Tommy, Emma said finally. He was at our house for Christmas dinner 2 years running. He fixed my bike when I was 13. He cried at Grandpa's funeral. People are complicated, Sarah replied, though the words felt inadequate. Sometimes they do things that surprise us, things that don't match who we thought they were. But why keep the car all this time? If he was angry enough to steal it, why not just sell it and be done with it? It was a question that would haunt Sarah in the days to come. She thought she understood part of Tommy's motivation, the sense of being overlooked, of having his contributions undervalued, of deserving more than he'd received. But the decision to preserve the car rather than profit from it suggested something more complex than simple greed or revenge. Maybe Tommy had loved Roberto too in his own way. Maybe he'd stolen the car not to hurt Sarah, but to keep a piece of Roberto for himself, to maintain some connection to the man who had been more of a father to him than his own father had ever been. Maybe the monthly visits to the warehouse had been a form of pilgrimage, a way of honoring Roberto's memory that only made sense in Tommy's conflicted heart. Or maybe Sarah was giving him too much credit. Maybe he'd simply been waiting for the heat to die down before selling the car, and the careful maintenance had been nothing more than an investment in future profit. As evening fell and they prepared to close the shop, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. "We're going to take it for a drive," she announced. Emma looked up from the invoice she'd been pretending to organize. "What?" "The Corvette. We're going to take it for a drive like we talked about, right now before I lose my nerve." "But Mom, shouldn't we wait until the police investigation is finished? What if there's evidence?" "The police have already photographed everything they need," Sarah interrupted. "And I'll be damned if I'm going to let Tommy Sullivan's betrayal rob us of one more moment with Dad's car. We've waited 3 years for this. We're not waiting another day." Emma's face lit up with an excitement that reminded Sarah painfully of Roberto. "Really? We can really take it out?" "Really," Sarah confirmed, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "Go get your jacket. We're going to watch the sunset from Miller's Point, just like your grandfather and I used to do." As Sarah turned the key and heard the Corvette's engine purr to life, she felt something she hadn't experienced since Roberto's death. A sense of continuity, of connection to something larger than her immediate troubles. The betrayal hurt, and the financial implications were serious, but none of that could change the fundamental truth of what this car represented. It was Roberto's legacy, yes, but it was also Sarah's inheritance and Emma's birthright. It was a reminder that some things endure despite the people who try to take them away, that love and craftsmanship and family bonds are stronger than greed or resentment or the petty grievances that sometimes drive people to do terrible things. As they pulled out of the garage and onto Main Street, Sarah caught sight of their reflection in the shop window. A mother and daughter in a classic red Corvette, heading toward whatever adventures the evening might bring. It was exactly the image Roberto would have wanted to see, exactly the future he had envisioned when he'd spent all those weekends teaching Sarah the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. Tommy Sullivan might have stolen 3 years from them, but he hadn't stolen the car's heart, hadn't diminished its power to connect them to Roberto's memory, hadn't broken the chain of love and knowledge that stretched from grandfather to mother to daughter. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 4. The Road Home. The drive to Miller's Point took Sarah and Emma through the heart of Millbrook's autumn landscape, past farms where corn had been harvested and fields where cattle stood in patient groups against the November cold. The Corvette handled like a dream, its restoration quality suspension and perfectly tuned engine making the winding country roads feel like a racetrack designed specifically for their pleasure. Emma sat in the passenger seat with the same expression of wonder that Sarah remembered wearing during her own first rides in the car. The wind whipped through their hair despite the November chill, because Roberto had always insisted that a convertible should be driven with the top down whenever possible, weather be damned. "Tell me about the first time Grandpa took you up here," Emma said, as they climbed the hill toward the scenic overlook that had been Roberto's favorite destination. Sarah smiled, the familiar story bringing comfort even in the midst of everything they'd learned about Tommy's betrayal. "I was 12, and I'd just helped him install the rebuilt carburetor. It was the first major job he'd let me do mostly on my own. And when we got it running perfectly, he said we had to celebrate properly." "With ice cream," Emma guessed, knowing her grandfather's weakness for celebrations involving dessert. "With a sunset drive to Miller's Point. He said every car deserved to see beautiful places, and every mechanic deserved to enjoy the fruits of their labor." Sarah downshifted as they approached the steepest part of the climb, the Corvette's engine responding with a satisfying growl. "We sat up here for an hour, watching the sun go down over the valley, and he told me stories about all the places he wanted to take this car someday. Did he ever get to take those trips?" Sarah's smile faded slightly. "Some of them. He and your grandmother drove it to Niagara Falls for their anniversary one year, and he took it to the big car show in Detroit several times. But most of his dreams were bigger than his circumstances allowed. He always talked about driving Route 66 or taking it to California to see the Pacific Ocean. They reached the top of Miller's Point just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. Sarah pulled into the small parking area and turned off the engine, and for a moment they sat in the sudden silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The view from Miller's Point hadn't changed in the 20 years since Sarah had first seen it from this passenger seat. The valley spread out below them like a patchwork quilt, small farms and woodlands stitched together by roads that curved and meandered according to the natural contours of the land. In the distance, the lights of Millbrook were just beginning to twinkle as businesses closed and families settled in for the evening. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly. "Your grandfather always said this was the best view in Michigan," Sarah replied. "He claimed you could see 3 counties from up here on a clear day." They got out of the car and walked to the wooden railing that marked the edge of the overlook. The November air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke from chimneys below and the promise of the first snow of the season. "Mom," Emma said after they'd stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, "what are we going to do about Tommy?" It was the question Sarah had been dreading, the one that had been lurking beneath the surface of their celebration like a dark undercurrent. She'd been trying to focus on the joy of having the Corvette back, but she couldn't escape the reality of what Tommy's actions meant for their family and their business. "I don't know," she admitted. "Detective Morrison will handle the criminal charges, but the financial damage—" She trailed off, not wanting to burden Emma with the full scope of their problems. "How bad is it?" Emma asked, and Sarah realized her daughter was old enough to deserve an honest answer. If Tommy really has been draining Dad's consulting account for 3 years, it could be $20,000 or $30,000, maybe more. Sarah leaned against the railing, suddenly feeling very tired. "That's money we could have used to modernize the shop, to build up our customer base, to put away for your college education." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this. "But we'll get it back, right? When they arrest Tommy, he'll have to pay it back?" "Maybe some of it," Sarah said carefully. "But people who embezzle money usually spend it as fast as they steal it. And even if Tommy has assets we can claim, it could take years to work through the legal system." The sun was getting lower, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that reminded Sarah of the autumn afternoons she'd spent here with Roberto. She found herself wondering what her father would have done in this situation, how he would have handled the betrayal by someone he'd trusted and mentored. "You know what the worst part is," she said suddenly. "What?" "I keep thinking about all the times Tommy was at the shop during those 3 years. All the conversations we had about Dad, about missing him, about wishing we could find the car. He sat there and listened to me cry about losing the last piece of my father, and all the time he knew exactly where it was." Emma reached over and took her mother's hand. "That's pretty awful. But maybe he was struggling with it too. Maybe he wanted to tell you but didn't know how." Sarah looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and surprise. At 17, Emma was already showing the kind of emotional wisdom that some adults never developed. It was a quality Roberto would have admired, and probably one he'd helped nurture during his years as Emma's grandfather. "You might be right," Sarah said, "but that doesn't make what he did okay." "No, it doesn't. But maybe it makes it, I don't know, more human. Like Tommy's not some evil person who wanted to hurt us. He's just someone who made a really bad choice and then kept making bad choices to cover up the first one." They stood together watching the sunset, both lost in their own thoughts about forgiveness, betrayal, and the complicated nature of human relationships. Finally, as the sun touched the horizon and painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Sarah spoke again. "Whatever happens with Tommy, we're going to be okay," she said. "The shop is still running, you're going to graduate and probably be a better mechanic than your grandfather and I combined. And we have this car back. We have each other, and we have Dad's legacy. That's more than a lot of people can say." Emma squeezed her mother's hand. "And if the money situation gets really bad, I can always take a gap year before college. Work at the shop full-time, help build up the business." "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly. "Your education is not negotiable. Your grandfather would haunt both of us if we let financial problems interfere with your future." "Then what do we do?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, an idea slowly forming in her mind. It was risky, maybe even foolish, but it felt right in a way that surprised her. "We expand," she said finally. "Expand what?" "The business. We stop trying to survive on basic repairs and start specializing in something that can really bring in money." Sarah gestured toward the Corvette. "Classic car restoration." Emma's eyes widened. "Really? You think we could do that?" "I think your grandfather taught us everything we need to know about bringing old cars back to life. And I think there are plenty of people out there who have classic cars sitting in garages, just waiting for someone with the skills and passion to make them beautiful again." The idea was gaining momentum in Sarah's mind as she spoke. She thought about all the half-finished project cars she'd seen over the years, the owners who'd started restorations they couldn't complete, the collectors who'd buy cars at auctions and then realize they lacked the expertise to restore them properly. "We'd need more space," she said, thinking out loud. "Better equipment. Maybe we could rent the old Hendricks building on Oak Street. It's been empty since the hardware store closed. And we'd need to advertise, let people know we're doing restoration work," Emma added, caught up in the excitement of the plan. "We could start with 1 or 2 projects, build a reputation. Your grandfather always said that good work sells itself. If we do quality restorations, word will spread." As the sun disappeared behind the hills and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years, genuine excitement about the future. Not just hope for survival, but anticipation for growth, for challenge, for the satisfaction of building something meaningful. "What would we call it?" Emma asked. Sarah thought about Roberto's legacy, about the skills he'd passed down, about the importance of honoring the past while embracing the future. "Martinez Classic Restorations," she said. 3 generations of automotive excellence." 3 generations. You, me, and Grandpa. He may not be here physically, but everything we know, everything we can do, came from him. We're carrying his knowledge forward. They drove home in comfortable silence, both lost in dreams of restored classics and expanded opportunities. The Corvette handled the winding country roads like it was glad to be back where it belonged, and Sarah found herself thinking about all the Sunday drives she and Roberto had taken, all the conversations they'd had about cars and life and the satisfaction of fixing things that were broken. When they pulled into the garage, Sarah was surprised to see Detective Morrison's car parked outside. He was waiting by the shop door, and his expression suggested he had news. "Sarah, Emma," he said as they got out of the Corvette, "I wanted to update you on the Sullivan investigation." "Did you find him?" Sarah asked. Morrison nodded grimly. "Chicago PD picked him up this afternoon. He's waived extradition and should be back in Michigan by tomorrow, but there's something else you need to know." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. "What?" "Sullivan wants to make a deal. Full confession, cooperation with the investigation, restitution for the stolen money. His lawyer says he's prepared to liquidate assets to make you whole financially." "What kind of assets?" Emma asked. Morrison consulted his notebook. "Apparently he's been buying and flipping classic cars for the past 3 years, using the money from your father's consulting account as start-up capital. He's built up quite a business. Not legal, obviously, since he was using stolen funds, but profitable." Sarah felt a strange mixture of anger and admiration. Tommy had used Roberto's money to start the exact kind of business she'd just been dreaming about, and apparently he'd been successful at it. "How much are we talking about?" she asked. "His lawyer estimates he can cover the full amount he stole, plus interest and penalties, maybe $60,000 total when everything's liquidated. Sarah almost laughed at the irony. Tommy's betrayal, which had seemed like a devastating blow just hours earlier, might actually end up providing the capital they needed to expand the business and pursue their dreams of classic car restoration. "There's one more thing," Morrison said. "Sullivan has asked to speak with you personally. He wants to apologize, to explain why he did what he did. You're under no obligation to see him, of course." Sarah looked at the Corvette, gleaming under the garage lights like a symbol of everything that had been lost and found again. She thought about forgiveness, about understanding, about the complicated nature of human motivations. "I'll think about it," she said finally. After Morrison left, Sarah and Emma stood in the garage, both processing the day's revelations. The Corvette sat between them like a bridge connecting past to future, carrying Roberto's legacy forward into new possibilities. $60,000, Emma said wonderfully. "That's enough to rent the Hendricks building, buy equipment, maybe even hire another mechanic." "It's enough to turn our dreams into reality," Sarah agreed. "Your grandfather always said that sometimes the worst things that happen to us end up leading to the best things. Maybe he was right." As they covered the Corvette with its protective tarp, a nightly ritual Sarah remembered from childhood, she found herself thinking about the strange circularity of events. Tommy's betrayal had nearly destroyed her faith in people, but it had also forced her to think beyond mere survival, to envision a future worthy of Roberto's legacy. "Mom," Emma said as they turned off the garage lights, "are you going to talk to Tommy?" Sarah paused in the doorway, looking back at the covered Corvette. "Yes," she said finally. "I think I need to understand why he did it. Not to forgive him necessarily, but to make peace with it. And then we get to work. We build something beautiful, something your grandfather would be proud of. We take everything he taught us and use it to create a future that honors his memory while making our own mark on the world." As they walked toward the house, Sarah felt the weight of the past 3 years beginning to lift from her shoulders. The Corvette was home, the truth was revealed, and the future, uncertain but full of possibility, stretched out before them like an open road on a perfect Sunday afternoon. Behind them, under its protective tarp, Roberto's Corvette waited patiently for its next adventure, ready to carry another generation of Martinez women toward whatever dreams they were brave enough to pursue. The end epilogue. 6 months later, the grand opening of Martinez Classic Restorations drew crowds from 3 counties, just as Roberto's shop had in its heyday. The renovated Hendricks building buzzed with activity as visitors admired the 3 completed restorations on display: a 1965 Mustang convertible, a 1969 Camaro SS, and centerpiece of the show, Roberto's 1957 Corvette, now serving as both inspiration and advertisement for the quality of work the Martinez women could deliver. Emma, now 18 and officially enrolled in automotive technology courses at the community college, guided tours through the expanded facility with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. Sarah watched from across the room, her heart full of pride and possibility. Tommy Sullivan had served 4 months in county jail and was now working at a dealership in Grand Rapids, trying to rebuild his life. Sarah had visited him once, a difficult conversation that had provided closure, if not complete understanding. He'd cried, she'd listened, and they'd both acknowledged that some betrayals, while forgivable, could never be forgotten. The restitution money had indeed transformed their business, but more importantly, it had restored Sarah's faith in the future. As she stood in their new showroom, watching Emma explain the intricacies of carburetor rebuilding to a fascinated collector, Sarah could almost hear Roberto's voice on the wind. "Mija, sometimes you have to lose something to understand how much it was worth. But the things that really matter, love, family, knowledge, integrity, those things can never be stolen." Outside, a late spring sunset painted the Michigan sky in shades of cherry red, and Sarah smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new restorations, and new opportunities to carry Roberto's legacy forward into an uncertain but promising future. Thanks for watching. Some cars come back to life, others bring someone back with them. See you in the next story, right here on Rust and Memory.